Hello and welcome to another episode of Pakistonomy. My name is Uzair, and if you've been a regular listener of this podcast, then perhaps you remember the September 2021 episode I had with Akhil Berry about Sri Lanka, its economic situation, the role the pandemic had played in the political economy, and what the outlook was. And in that conversation, Akhil had mentioned that a lot of things were sort of on the edge in the island nation, and things could go either way, and the outlook was not looking that strong. Fast forward to today in March 2022, and things really have hit an inflection point. There's an economic crisis in Sri Lanka. It's been in the headlines in terms of what's going on. The economic situation is leading to a political crisis. And so I figured that it's time that we revisit what's going on over there and understand the causes and the implications of the economic crisis in the island nation and what the path forward looks like. So joining me today is Asanga Abeyagoonasekara. He's a senior fellow at the Millennium Project and an international security analyst from the country. He's led two government think tanks providing strategic advocacy in the country, and he was the founding director general of the national security think tank under the Ministry of Defense in Sri Lanka. He's also author of Sri Lanka at a Crossroads, which is a book, if you want to learn more about the country, you perhaps may want to buy it and take a look. I'm looking really forward to this conversation to understand what's going on. So Asanga, thank you so much for taking out the time today and joining us here on Pakistonomy.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for having me.
I want to start with basically an understanding of what's going on in Sri Lanka. Obviously, there have been, I've been getting WhatsApp messages of pictures and headlines about what's going on. Pakistanis themselves are concerned about what's going on in Sri Lanka, less so about the events on the island nation, but also more so about sort of what it foreshadows for Pakistan's own economy, which is no stranger to the IMF and debt and being in this state of crisis on the political economy front. So help us understand what the latest developments are, where things stand today, and what's going on in Sri Lanka.
Well, there's a serious economic crisis, as you must have seen from the news everywhere from around the world. They're reporting on the crisis. The depth of the crisis is quite, I would say, very serious. It has affected the middle class, and many in the society. You hear deaths already reporting where senior citizens have died waiting for fuel for long hours, around 8 hours of power cuts. You have children without without the examination examination papers, so being cancelled. So multiple serious issues like the essential food items are not there, so basically not available for. And you have protest, which is in Colombo as well as even yesterday. So what you have is like thousands of people gathering, protesting with this crisis. So you have economic crisis, which has triggered from a liquidity problem as well as the insolvency problem. So the liquidity issue is clearly on there's no foreign reserves left. Basically, the Sri Lanka requires about 6 billion, 6.9 billion this year, but then what is left is like about 6.9 billion of debt is remaining, and so what the reserves that Sri Lanka has is less than 2 billion right now. So we have a serious issue of bringing the imports in, paying for the imports, and then you have dysfunctionality, which is a serious issue, which we saw as researchers. Many of them did see, not only on the economic front, but also on the political front. Some of my writings, like the Coming Anarchy in Sri Lanka, which was published last year in June, saw the deterioration of the human rights space as well as democratic space, where the centrifugal forces, such as impacting the democracy, the autocratic footprint growing with the heavy militarization. So those are all part of it, the dysfunctionality. So the economic crisis, I think, was an eye-opener for the government to look at various, stakeholders now, and to address it. So it's a serious situation. People are dying, so people need the essential foods, but then to get the essential foods, even from the port, where has been quite difficult because the institutions are not functioning properly, the government institutions. So whatever the assistance to get it to the common people as well as the general public has been quite difficult. It's a huge challenge, and it is happening at the sort of tail end of the pandemic. And we suffered from the pandemic, and heavily as a nation that depends on tourism mainly. So it's been multiple effects that has sort of been doing, and then the regime's position, I would call it an inward a prescription, a political nationalist prescription, inward policy that they adopted, had sort of ripple effects.
So help me understand this. So the Rajapaksa brothers have been in power before. And so the parallel that I have being a Pakistani American is that, Pakistan has had the Sharif brothers who've been in power, and they're actually vying for power again right now as we speak. And Imran Khan is facing pressure, but their pitch, so to speak, to the elites and the non-elite segments of society is that we know how to govern. And so when I look at the Rajapaksas, I'm like, okay, well, they've been in power before, they know how to govern. So what is it that has gone wrong in this insular approach, inward-looking approach of the current government, that perhaps people like me who very loosely follow Sri Lanka did not see coming? Because from the outside, I'm like, well, they've been here before, so why is it that the political system is unable to grapple with the seriousness of the challenge that exists in Sri Lanka today?
Well, there's a difference between the two brothers' regimes, I would say. I served as the executive director of the foreign policy think tank during Mahinda Rajapaksa's entire term, that is 2005-15. So if you analyze the both regimes, the foreign policy tilt is quite the same, which is a China tilt, which Mahinda also practiced, which Gotabaya is also practicing. But when it comes to the economic policy, as well as the policies that Mahinda try to sort of the political dimensions, I would say the political economic policies adopted were more practical, I would say, and which his ministers didn't leave him. I mean, that is the best sort of I would say the barometer you can have, because here you have 3 ministers resigning, already 2 resigned weeks ago, then 1 senior minister in January. So during Mahinda's time, actually, he managed to keep the politics going. The two terms that he served, ending a war, 30-year war, a civil war. His popularity was at quite a high, very high during 2009 after the end with the Sinhalese Buddhist majority. And then the minority community also, he managed to, somewhat keep them with to listen to them as well as with the political establishment. There were concerns on human rights. There were issues on various democratic backsliding, even during his time. But I think because of his political maturity of being 30 years in politics, he managed to keep everyone basically by keep them as well as maneuver, I would say, during his tenure. So here you have heavy militarization going on, like 28 military appointments, which Mahinda never had, and he kept the military out of politics, and he never appointed in this scale. So you have a foreign secretary who's military, you have several others who are military right now. Then you have a solution also, like if something goes wrong, they have a military appointment, like the Director General for Essential Services is a military. So Mahinda never did that. So I think because of his maturity in politics, understanding how the Sri Lankan political environment. So here, what you have is Gotabaya coming as very, I will say, he comes in with a 2/3 majority, and the problem is that I think the heavy autocratic sentiments that he tried to bring in to the regime, such as the removing of checks and balances at the beginning of his regime, from the parliament, like different institutions, and then you have heavy militarization. So the interference to the bureaucracy, as well as multiple concerns, the arrests that was made from the PTA. So that's the Prevention of Terrorism Act, which they use in Sri Lanka for extrajudicial arrests. So when I read the human rights report, even this time, which was from the Office of the High Commissioner of Human Rights, absolutely, what she has captured is true. So there is a serious concern that's going on, which is kind of a stealth operation. But you see, the autocracies also has a sort of a learning curve. They also grow. And what you have to, I think, understand is that there is a significant difference between the two brothers. But Mahinda's time and Gotabaya's time, you see more brothers joining as well. There's 6. So totally there are 4 brothers, and then you have the sons of them also. So I would say the highest number of the cabinet appointments from in a family ruled country is in Sri Lanka. So the top down, the heavy, I would say, vertical political axis which they try to create has a concern with the Sri Lanka's democratic institutions as well as the bureaucracy and ways are they to function. So it was a serious impediment, and which it became, and now it's very clear. So that's actually the difference between the two.
One of the things I remember from my conversation with Akhil a few months ago was, his point about policies in agriculture and broader economy that were going to cause trouble down the path. And I would love for you to sort of help us understand where is it exactly on the economic front that the government has faltered over the last few months and a year or so, and that has exacerbated perhaps the crisis that Akhil saw coming at that time. And I want to get to the foreign policy China slant in just a moment, but domestically, what is it that you think on the economic front are areas where perhaps poor decision-making and insular approach, an approach that perhaps was not as mature as the previous governments, has led to a higher cost being exacted of the Sri Lankan people?
Definitely. So Akhil's observation on the fertilizer crisis is a very good example on the inward nationalist policies that impacted the country as well as the agriculture sector. Then you have multiple inward approaches taken. One is the losing of the Millennium Challenge Corporation grant, which was a very clear example, which I have pointed in my writings, as well as even 6-7 months ago, I have mentioned several times about it. So what really happened was when Gotabaya Rajapaksa came into power, so he appointed a presidential commission to look at the USMCC grant, and then the commission came up with a concocted, basically what the regime wanted to hear. So saying that there's a national security threat from the MCC. So,
which I'm sorry to interrupt you here, which is also a typical tactic of authoritarian governments all over the world. When they don't want to do something, it's a national security threat.
Exactly. So national security became the serious main theme of Gotabaya, because here is a leader who came to power after a terrorist attack, which is 2019 Easter Sunday terror attack, who got so popular because what happened was the the centripetal forces that after the 2019 Easter Sunday attack, where a community wanted to come together to see a solution, was taken by, I would say, politicized and taken by the ultra-nationalists, saying that this is the solution where a military leader, with a military background, is required. So the 2/3 majority came in this sort of environment. So the ultra-nationalist position was from the nationalist groups, nationalist sentiments that, that they're part of the political establishment. Unfortunately, losing MCC grant, weaponizing it, saying that it is a serious national security threat. Then you have the East Container Terminal, again, with the tripartite agreement with Japan, India, was swapped now to the West Container Terminal. So you're losing time, you're losing money, you're losing investments. Then the Japanese LRT, the light railway train. So again, seen as, not a feasible project, but working. What I saw was that my analysis during that time was, how did the Chinese win so many projects and how did the others keep losing it? So while China axis was becoming stronger, as well as the sphere of influence of the Chinese was getting much stronger. And the best example is the port city. Port city is a project that is done in Colombo, and it was a reclaimed land from the sea, and it was a massive project comparing to all the other projects in Sri Lanka. So what the Chinese did was they managed to win basically a territory of a special economic zone with the extra jurisdictional rights, and from the Gotabaya Rajapaksa regime. So here is the president who came with the election manifesto saying that he would negotiate with the Chinese even to get back the Hambantota port or reduce the terms. So if you look at his election manifesto, he came to power from that, promising to the people. But then again, there is no negotiations with the Chinese. So nowhere. I've been looking at several BRI projects. So once it's signed, it's signed. So 99 years we have given to Chinese in Hambantota. And Port City also, the commission that was established, the special economic zone, there is no, even the future leaders will not be able to revisit them. So there is a danger that I see in my work. Basically, my work focuses mainly on China, in South Asia, and China in Sri Lanka. So that I see where the Indians call a Brahmachalni, who coined the word debt trap. And I add something to the debt trap, that because there is an issue of debt trap. Debt trap doesn't basically capture the non-financial aspects. So my work has been on the non-financial aspects, that I call it, there is a strategic trap rather than a debt trap. Debt trap argument has been sort of, there's various versions coming out from different countries, saying that the commercial loans are much higher than the Chinese, and even in Sri Lanka, some of the academics do speak about it, looking at the data. But the concern here is the strategic trap. For example, there is an airport in Sri Lanka without any flights coming in near the port of Hambantota, but built closer to a wildlife sanctuary, and there is no operations going on for the last 6-7 years or 8 years. Why is that? So there is a strategic dimension to it, these projects, that I see that China would definitely benefit out of these projects. And even in Hambantota, the 99 years, the lease that they have, they managed to secure is a great sort of asset, I would say, to the Chinese. And while the present leaders would say that we will not allow China to establish a military base or whatever, but there is no guarantee for the future leaders to make it a military establishment, just like what happened in Djibouti. So my analysis is that 20 to 30 years, which my new book is The Conundrum of an Island, which I speak about these things. So on strategic assets and how the strategic assets could be used for strategic traps. So these are areas that I think a lot of other countries also could learn in South Asia. And that Sri Lanka, the problems of the Rajapaksas is that, even Mahinda's Rajapaksas, that you immediately, he starts with a balanced, non-aligned foreign policy, where even in his election manifesto in 2005, he mentioned about non-aligned essence, non-aligned, Sri Lanka is a non-aligned country. We need to have a balanced foreign policy. But when it comes to practice, there is a serious bandwagoning with the Chinese that I see. And that has multiple effects to the economy, to the political space, and also even the political space from the political party. And Gotabaya's last conversation, like the phone conversation with President Xi, where he says that he would like to implement the Chinese development model. So these are sort of new experiments done in a democracy, but then you have to be extremely careful. Because how I see is that even China is also doing their own experiments still. So they're trying to get it right. And Sri Lanka is not in a position to support Chinese human rights issues in Xinjiang, which our foreign secretary did. He spoke, this is the first time in our history that a foreign secretary has spoken in defense of China's Xinjiang. But China has always stood with Sri Lanka on even this time at the Human Rights Council. China has supported Sri Lanka. So it's sort of a reciprocal arrangement. But the countries that support Sri Lanka, unfortunately, are Syria, Russia, North Korea. And while the government keeps this insular or inward-looking policy, saying that basically not welcoming any of the observations or from the international community. So I think it needs a sort of recalibration of its policies, the inward-looking policies, from the economic, from political. So I see some progress, which is the all-party president recently announced and had this all-party conference where all political party leaders were invited. So that's in the right direction. And again, for the last few months, there's been some improvements on the balancing act with China as well as India and the IMF. So those are all positive signs.
I want to sort of double click on something that you said about, manifestos saying one thing about non-aligned sort of positions on foreign policy and things then not working out the way that perhaps the manifesto indicated. As a Pakistani, I'm no stranger to that myself. But one of the things that I've thought about and would love your thoughts on this is that, obviously there's a strategic dimension to Chinese financing. There's debt trap diplomacy, as others have argued. But that sort of disconnects the agency countries like Sri Lanka and its political elites perhaps have. And I would love your thoughts on why is it or what is it that causes elites to perhaps ignore these risks that their own country faces through these choices that they're making? Because it's not just a one-way street, right? Obviously, China, like any major power, will exercise influence and demand strategic and non-strategic payouts based on the investments or loans or things that it's giving to a country like Sri Lanka or Pakistan or other parts of the world. But why is it that perhaps leaders ignore the peril of those choices and not sort of make choices that would be optimal for their own national security interests?
Well, it's a very important question, as well as valuable insights from that question that you can draw. I mean, if you look at the recent Carnegie report, which Deb did, it was really, this talks about the agency, how the Chinese have managed to, establish sort of their relationship with political elites, as well as different, groups in the society. They, if you look at it in Sri Lankan case, it's a clear capture of the elites from the Chinese. How did the capture happen? Is because of the massive Chinese investments that's going on. For example, the highway network, where you have different groups in the society who has benefited from these projects. Not only the politicians, but also the other stakeholders of these projects, such as the construction subcontractors, multiple sort of stakeholders. So you have, China became the largest, the partner, I would say the trade partner in Sri Lanka, surpassing India. But the concern here is that the capture, how they manage is through their projects, the large, if you look at the infrastructure projects, from highways, water, power, telecommunications. If you look at the entire Sri Lankan, we try to map in one of our projects back in 2021, and there was a project which we did for USA, as well as several other. You could see that the Chinese expansion or the influence going into various districts of Sri Lanka, as well as sectors. China has I would say, a strategy when it comes for payments. I would say the opaqueness, the transparency. So the way they practice their models. For example, now China gave $2.5 million recently for the economic crisis in Sri Lanka. But that even if you look at the Argentinian case, now Argentina received $45 billion from IMF this month. Again, China is also funding Argentina. But these are not the same. I think Sri Lanka, what needs to understand is from the models that's happening from outside, they're not the same. Sort of what the Chinese trying to do, 2.5, is not the same as what the IMF trying to do for the bailout. And those assistance are probably for the Chinese projects to sustain, and maybe for their development, because the conditionalities of this assistance has to be read. So the ambassador has mentioned about the 2.5 that we given to 1 billion last year. So it's important to understand the conditionalities because of the opaqueness of these loans. So I think there is a pattern that was discovered from the Carnegie report, which is really, really important that for most of the South Asian countries. So the corruption is also a serious issue where the political elites could be easily captured. And it's a serious concern that is going on. And China needs to improve its processes. And so that's something that the host countries need to do that. So because even the airport example, which I gave you, that the China has built, what the Chinese say is that the request was from the Sri Lankan government that you wanted the airport, we build the airport. So you wanted the port, we build the port. So it's again, so if we requested, we should have also, we should have a mechanism to assist their processor and how to a better way to sort of do these projects. The processes has to improve definitely. So if it continues like this, then you'll see much more.
Yeah, one of the things that I remember an interlocutor once told me was like, the Chinese may be giving, let's say, $1 billion for payment support, but essentially that money, it goes from one bank account in Beijing to another, while the loan shows up on the balance sheet of the state bank. And that has to be paid by the taxpayers eventually, or in strategic terms, eventually by the country that is taking out the loan, but the money never lands in the country itself. It echoes what you were just saying and describing as well. You mentioned the $2.5 billion coming from the Chinese state of affairs with the IMF, where things stand. Obviously, Sri Lanka needs immediate balance of payments support. And so help us understand what the state of play there is How much money is it that is currently in the gap that needs to be bridged? Who are the contenders providing the support, and what is the status of the IMF program?
I think Sri Lanka needs a sort of objective strategy here, because what we have is an economy. We don't even back then. So about a year ago, it was clearly understood that even before Gotabaya, that the Rajapaksa's regime. So I mean, his inward policies were definitely part of it, issues, but then he did inherit a serious fragment of a dysfunctionality coming from the previous regimes also, including his brothers. The projects which didn't generate much income. You borrow so much, but then there is no income coming out of these projects. So,
yeah, sorry to interrupt again here, but I would just add, it's also, I don't know about Sri Lanka, but I've seen this in other BRI projects, is that while the cost of the project is, or the loans are in dollar denominated terms, the income is in local currency, which in and of itself causes a balance of payments crisis as well.
Absolutely correct. That's what that's an direct impact to the issue right now. We are borrowing, we are building infrastructure. There's no returns, but then the returns are in local currency. But then it doesn't generate much. I mean, why would you build an airport 500 million? Then you don't have anything. You don't have flights coming in. So that, I mean, it's a huge, I would say, a burden to the economy. So what you have is, and also the income that's from that the government can generate, which is from the taxes and all that, bare minimum. So it cannot function. The economy cannot function in this manner. So IMF would definitely bring some objective perspectives, how to bring this economy back again to a sustainable manner, rather than just borrowing from X, Y, Z countries and collecting the funds, but then you don't know how to sort of what to do with these funds, rather than settling the next default. It's not about settling the next default. I think Sri Lanka needs a long-term objective strategy, because the projects that at least we learned a lesson right now. I mean, all of them have learned a lesson, including the regime as well as the others. So it's an eye-opener for all of the policymakers there. I mean, I would say even in the previous regime or the ones before. So to understand not to invest in, sort of the projects that you can't generate any sort of income, as well as even the port city, massive, infrastructure developed. When I did interview the Chinese managing director of the port city, he clearly mentioned that there will be European investors coming in, there will be US investors coming in, but where are they? So for the last 2 years, they have not been in the site. There is no European investor in the port city. So there are questions, those are questions that the Sri Lankan government actually should be asking. The thing of the issue, the biggest problem that I see is that when these concerns are raised by researchers or critical thinking, so you see that the autocratic sentiments, suppressing them, and they're not. I mean, you see, they see it as working against the regime or working against a project. There's no intention to work, against projects or against there's nothing like that. So I think this is something that the government also needs to understand and be a bit matured in their policy making as well as decision making, bringing those important observations in. So right now you have an economic crisis which need massive amounts of funding. I mean, you need, as I mentioned, about 6.9 billion you need this year. And Sri Lanka doesn't have even 2 billion or less right now. So IMF would definitely put things in order. But then The reason that we didn't go for IMF assistance even several months before is because, again, because of the inward nationalist policies of the government, saying that IMF would come over and take over the country. There will be a national security issue, just like the MCC, the Millennium Challenge Corporation. So how did Nepal take? I mean, Nepal was extremely clever. They took the MCC. They had protests, they had issues, but I would praise the Nepalese the policymakers for bravely taking it, as well as it is a grant. And you could use it the way, because we studied it. We studied the entire report of the MCC. We didn't see any national security threat. So if you go on the national security threat, like, for example, even the human rights issue, which is Sri Lanka is having right now, if you keep on saying that the LTT is coming back or the Tamil Tigers are coming back, that's not true. There is no signals, or there's nothing to say that the LTT or but you can keep saying it and propel the nationalists or the ultra nationalists, but there is no benefit end of the day of doing that. While again the government is requesting diaspora funding. Now here's the thing: so you are asking for diaspora funding to come in, while you're not agreeing for devolution of power. Then you are trying to suppress a certain minority. I would say the NGOs. I was very disturbed to see when the NGO director, one of the Dr. Jahankar, recently he wrote a piece on Colombo Telegraph. He mentioned that the interference of the NGO space. We saw it in 2021, a research which I did, how the government, I would say, the surveillance or what's going on. But there is no, the end result will be not a positive sign, of course, towards the democratic values, as well as Sri Lanka can, as a small island, an important littoral in the strategic routes of the Indian Ocean, can play a huge role. But I think it's very important that you calibrate this and have a long-term objective policy in place.
Yeah, I think one of the things that perhaps I find most interesting is, on the one hand, you have these authoritarian regimes, and Sri Lanka is one of them in that sense that when you look at things like the MCC paperwork and ask the question and say there's no issues, it's a national security problem and it's clamped down on. But then when you look at Chinese funded projects and ask the same set of questions, you're not even allowed to ask those questions. And that's also a national security problem. And it's like, well, you can't have it both ways, right?
Yeah. So this happened in Sri Lanka. We had this East Container Terminal tripartite agreement. So the government came and cancelled it, saying because the union leaders came to the news and said, because of geopolitics, they are against the project. So I quickly picked it up and mentioned that union leaders don't talk geopolitics. They talk about wages, labor issues, but for the first time, union leaders did speak about geopolitics in a port. But here's the thing, was there a hand from China, to propel those? So those are the important observations that the government needs to listen. There are multiple, I would say, that's why you mentioned about Sri Lanka at Crossroads. That's my initial work where I try to capture the triple spears of influence in Sri Lanka. So China and India, and also the US. So the three spears of influence. The Sri Lanka is because of the geostrategic position. So it's, you need to sort of balance and sort of have a sustainable policy, which is a long-term policy, rather than sort of, hedging. So I mentioned about bandwagoning and hedging, which is done by this particular government, saying that because the foreign secretary came and said, we have India first policy. And then he immediately corrected and said that we have Sri Lanka first policy. So it doesn't, it won't work in this, I think, especially in this era. So what you need to do is sort of balance it, as well as see those strategic dimensions, because you're losing a lot by either, calling it national security or calling it whatever. So it's very important that Sri Lanka at least now, reach out as well as get assistance from multiple countries, advice, and so that's the journey that I see ahead.
You mentioned like Nepal in this conversation, and I always think about Bangladesh and their strategy in terms of how they've played sort of the long game. And in the region, at least outside of the sort of, in the middle small powers, I find Bangladesh sort of following the most pragmatic approach and the most strategic approach, that is Bangladesh first, you could describe it, because they're good with the Japanese, they're good with the Americans, they're good with the Chinese, they're good with the Gulf countries. And there's something to be learned, and perhaps I need to dig a bit deeper into how and why Bangladesh has sort of managed to navigate these waters perhaps better than most other countries in South Asia, because clearly it has worked out. Yes, there are issues with the United States here and there, but I think by and large, they've sort of stayed away from being fully in one camp and being fully captured. So I just wanted to mention Bangladesh along with your mention of Nepal here as well. But coming back to Sri Lanka, obviously, state of crisis, IMF, China giving some money. From your point of view, what are some near-term things that need to happen? You mentioned the All Parties Conference, which is indeed a positive step. But beyond that sort of stuff, what is it that the government needs to do to perhaps initially stabilize the economy and the political economy writ large, and then chart a course forward that perhaps leads to sustainable growth?
Immediately, the country requires a course correction, because if you militarize, keep on doing this and sort of bringing a military footprint, it will erode the democratic fabric. So it'll have a serious impact for long term. So you need to minimize that or bring it to how it was, and have checks and balances immediately, the institutions functioning. So these are, I would say, the corruption, for example, the bribery commission that we have has to be independent. So multiple institutions. So the checks and balances are really important for the democracy. You need, I think, the human rights issue is a serious concern which needs to be heard. It has to be addressed. The grievances are serious, so that has to be addressed. The PTA, the Prevention of Terrorism Act, that the government has to address that. It keeps on delaying, looking at other acts in Singapore, for example, the Harmony Acts and Sedition Acts from Singapore. That won't work in Sri Lanka. If you even try to import the acts from Singapore, it's how you practice, how you put the law into practice. You can call anybody saying that he's against harmony and lock him up. You already have a PTA, then you bring two others. So countries that are assisting also for these judicial reforms need to be extremely careful. So here is a situation that you need a sort of a delicate balance in the foreign policy, very important. And Chinese, ambassadors visit to the northern province, which I have written about, which is on the ORF think tank, which I have written my observations, is a serious issue, how I read it. Because the Tamilian community, you have a very sensitive issue in Sri Lanka, which is we had an ethnic conflict for 3 decades almost. You had the largest bombing in 2019. So you have multiple security concerns. So you would have to sort of consider all these issues when you're making policies. Sri Lanka has developed, these are the achievements. I would say one of the greatest achievement the country had was we had a national defense policy, which was developed. And this was developed by the previous government. And it was approved by the cabinet of the previous government. But what the present government is just locking the document. It's basically inside the government quarters. So it has to be, so these things have to have an improvement. When you write a policy, it needs improvements every year. Not that each regime has a policy. So it's a policy to remain. And it was written by actually the present army commander was also part of the panel of writing these policies. So the thing is, the countries like Sri Lanka would need to sort of understand long-term policies. The regime would need to see a longer sort of a duration in when you're working on strategic projects. So these, I think the most important is right now to look at the economic, fixing the economic condition, because people are dying, people are hungry. I mean, yesterday I was listening to the news and it was very sad to hear a mother who was in tears. She doesn't have milk powder to feed. She has the money, she wants to buy, but it's not available. So apparently the food has come in, or whatever, the consignments have come into the port, but they can't clear it. There is some problem with the authorities as well as, so that's why I said the functioning of the authorities as well as this, all of this has to come in. So I think the immediate course correction with the assistance from outside, outside communities as well as the experts is required, and definitely India, Pakistan, many other countries. I mean, we have worked. His brother actually, Mahinda, I would say. I think the political experience, he had that experience to bring in multiple sort of inputs from various. So that is required right now, and the vertical axis, which is the 6 family members and all. So those things have to be addressed too, because the senior ministers are not happy, so they're resigning. And obviously, there is a limit that you can have in the families. It will have the entire. So, so it's important. I mean, the trust is, of course, Gotabaya had a military background. Yes, so there is a trust with the military. That doesn't mean that military can do everything. You cannot run economic ministry. You cannot run the essential service. The military doesn't want to do it. I mean, I have worked as in the security think tank. I've worked with the military, all 3 forces. They don't want to do that. So if you get them involved, that's a different story. So I think they're happy with the defense policies and working with it, and as well as there is a lot to do. I mean, as a country, an important littoral in the Indian Ocean. The Navy, it's the building of multiple issues. I mean, right now. The concerns the focus is in the Indian Ocean. So I think Sri Lanka would need to prepare as well as have a long-term strategy.
Yeah, I think one of the things that on the military side as well is you can bring them in, but it also causes a credibility problem for the armed forces themselves, right? Because they may not want to take over, but they're forced in that position, and the cost ultimate, which should be political costs, are borne by the armed forces themselves. And that's not good for a country like Sri Lanka, which already has fissures and internal strategic issues and external strategic issues to deal with. And I fully agree with you that dragging them into the day-to-day running of the economy and other parts of the political economy is perhaps unwise, because let them do their job, and the more you drag them into it, the more they lose their credibility over time if the crisis continues.
If I may add, we are in a reconciliation footing. So after 2009, the country went through a reconciliation program, a national reconciliation. So we as a nation are looking at post-war reconciliation, healing the wounds, working with the Tamilian community, now with the Muslim, all the communities. So it's on a reconciliation mode. What happened was that the ultra nationalist forces always try to hijack this moment. I would say, even the last government had it, the previous government had, the one before had it. There was a moment that you see there is something happening, but then again, the ultra nationalist forces. This is a common thing, I think, in our region. Then you have a dangerous element coming in. I mean, this is like bombs, which is one of my pieces, which is wrote conundrum of an island. That got more popular than the book, actually. There's one in it. It is called The Bombs and Elections in South Asia. So I try to look at bombs and elections, whether they have a connection. So these are areas, I think, it is a dangerous place, South Asia, when you look at the other parts of the region comparatively. So there, because of the security sensitivity of the countries that we live in. So we need to improve it. And there is a huge development, bilateral prospects between Pakistan, Sri Lanka, India, Sri Lanka. Many, it's not been explored. If you look at it regionally, we are not doing, regionally we are very poor. The multilateralism doesn't work at all. So there's a lot to be done. And having mini-laterals, we recently had a mini-lateral with India, Sri Lanka, and Maldives on security. I would want to see a wider sort of, not the mini-laterals, but in a wider scale. So a region would need to function in a way that, bringing all countries in and talking on these sensitive issues of security.
Yeah, I think South Asia's tragedy has been that it's the least integrated region in the world. And without integration, you cannot thrive economically, socially, collectively as a society. And that's been the great tragedy. Asanga, this has been a fantastic conversation. Again, thank you for taking out the time. Thank you for explaining to our audience all that is going on in Sri Lanka. It really is a very difficult period of time for the country, and we hope and pray that things turn around for the better, and then Sri Lanka emerges stronger from this crisis. Before I let you go, I always ask my guests, what are 2 or 3 books that you would recommend to the audience? It can be on any topic, can be about Sri Lanka, but anything goes.
Recently, I read The Long Game, an excellent book, Rush Doshi, on China, basically. So building, we call it blunting, building. So excellent how he looks at the Chinese regime. And there are a lot of reference to South Asia, how the BRI, and so Long Game is definitely one of them. One of the books that I've, during the Ukraine, the Ukraine war, which is going on right now. So I looked at on the thermonuclear war, which is a very interesting piece of work in 1960s done by Herman Kahn. Herman Kahn is the founder of Hudson Institute, and he's a futurist. So he tried to understand what if 2 countries possess nuclear weapons, and what would happen if they start fighting. Very interesting. You could see different perspectives you can actually bring in to the present crisis and what's going on. Then I would say third book. I also like Tanvi's book, The Fateful Triangle, which I read. I think it captures China, India, and US. So I like that. So those are the 3.
Yeah, we've had Tanvi on the podcast, and she's awesome. And I highly recommend I've read both The Fateful Triangle and The Long Game, and highly recommend those. On thermonuclear war, I think I read excerpts of it in IR grad school classes, but perhaps I need to pick it up and read the whole thing, given the moment in history we're living through right now. But Asanga, thank you again for taking out the time for joining us. Wish you and Sri Lanka all the best, and hope that perhaps we get to speak in better times for the island nation.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me.
Thank you.